the Revd Will Gibbs, and I have been asked to be the advocate for living in love and faith for the Diocese of St Albans. Welcome. The Church of England is currently in a process of encouraging parishes and chaplaincies all over the country to engage with the really amazing resources that have been prepared through a lot of work together through various strands and streams of human sciences and theology and biblical studies, church history and so on. And these resources are helping us to have conversations to explore topics about human sexuality and gender and how the church supports and lives with these kinds of questions. I know that matters of human sexuality aren't easy to talk about, but I would encourage us as best we can to have these conversations and especially to engage with the material and to run the course. We really want as many people in this diocese, the Diocese of St Albans, to share in a course. So in order to do that safely and well, we hope very much that pairs of people will be involved in facilitating the group. Each course is 5 sessions lasting about 90 minutes. And I'd encourage you, whether it's in your own parish or chaplaincy, you might want to partner with another neighbouring parish, or you might offer several courses across the deanery. You'd come together with other people and share in the resources and explore these things together. But how we do that is important, and facilitation is a really helpful tool to help to do that safely and well. Some people have been very bruised and hurt in the past when talking about human sexuality and wonder how safe the church is as a space for them. Others have very clear and strong views, and we need to be careful how we share those and how we listen to each other carefully and courteously. So I'm going to share some thoughts about how we might do that well as facilitators. So I'm going to share some slides and I'm going to talk us through those. Feel free to pause at any point if you want to and make some notes, or if you want to rewind and go back, you're very welcome to do that too. I hope this will be useful to you so that you will be able to, with perhaps one other person as a pair, you'd be able to facilitate the course where you are. So let's have a look together at some skills that might be helpful to us as we facilitate small groups. So welcome to this session. We're going to be using some slides which have been prepared by Eva John and the LLF national team. There are a few slides which I've added in as well, which I hope will be helpful and complement those. First thing to say something about what we hope to achieve in this half hour or so training session. Firstly, that we might get some new insights as facilitators. Most of us will have had some experience already of leading small groups, perhaps house groups, perhaps discussions within a PCC or a committee meeting, and we can build on those, but I hope that nonetheless we might be able to develop some further skills and develop those and have some new insights in our role as facilitators. I think we never stop learning and developing. It'd be really good for us to feel that was the case for us as facilitators. That we would be better equipped for some sensitive discussions. There's no getting away from the fact that living in love and faith touches on some very important but also difficult things to talk about. Some people have been quite hurt in the past. Others hold very strong views already, and we need some real care and skill in how we go about facilitating those discussions well. And that we would have confidence in doing that. I think a good facilitator is one who can exude some confidence and help to create a safe space that holds the group, and they can then within that safe environment feel able and comfortable to share their views, which may well be different to other people who are present. So it's about doing that with a confidence that comes across and is communicated, and people feel safe in that environment with us facilitating the discussions. So let's have a look at what we're going to do in this, the first half of the session, perhaps about 15 minutes or so. We're going to talk a little bit about facilitating sensitive discussions, and then we're going to go on to look at how we would do that specifically with the LLF course in mind. Again, perhaps about 15 minutes or so. You may well want to spend a little bit of time either pausing the video at various points or at the end of this session, just spend some time in reflection. So perhaps in total up to an hour, helping you to think about the skills that you're bringing to the table as a facilitator for your LLF course that you'll be running. So what is a facilitator? Well, I think it's often helpful for us to think a little bit about where a word comes from, a name. This is, if you think about the French word facile, it means easy. So I think our role as a facilitator is to make things easy in three particular ways. Easy to attend, so we might want to think carefully about the location, where we meet, the time, making it as easy as possible for people to get there, and the day of the week. Obviously with COVID at the moment, some people will choose to run their course online, and that's absolutely fine if you have the skills to do that with Zoom or Google online platforms and so on. That would be absolutely no problem, or Microsoft Teams, but others will feel happier to do that in person. I have to say, for myself, with the sorts of discussions that we have, my preference would be to try and do it face to face if you can, but each context will be different. But thinking about how you can make it as easy as possible for people to attend and take part in the course, making it well known, advertising it, encouraging people to take part. Also thinking about making sure that once they're in the sessions that everyone can speak, facilitating, making things easy by everybody having an opportunity to speak and participate. And then also easy to share ideas. In other words, making it a safe space so that people feel able to speak up and don't just stay silent with their thoughts, so they can fully participate. So that, I think, is the essence of what we should be about as a facilitator, making it as easy as possible in those ways. So how do we go about facilitating sensitive discussions? We need to think about our thinking. That's important. We need to think about triggers and also about conflict. So let's have a look at each of those. There are a number of steps that we go through when we think. The first would be one about observation. We notice something, and then we have a response. Then we try to interpret that, and then on the back of that we come to some kind of decision. So let's think about a fairly mundane, practical sort of example that might be helpful. You're walking along a road and you suddenly come across a dog coming straight towards you, and it might have for you a whole number of different reactions, and that might well be different for each of us. You might see this large dog coming towards you and think, oh, wonderful, I love dogs, I want to go towards it and perhaps stroke it. Or you might think, not so keen on dogs, I had a bad experience with a dog in my past, and that's not going to be so helpful, and I'm going to be quite wary about this. Or it may be one of curiosity. Who does this dog belong to? Where is it from? Is it from one of the homes nearby? Why is it here in the road? And so on. So a number of different responses that we might have that would be physiological but also emotional. So if we go through that process, we observe the dog coming towards us, we have a response. It may well be shaped by our past. We then try and interpret something and make sense of what it is that we're seeing and responding to, and then we decide what our next piece of action would be. There is is a danger that we jump straight in with a response. And one of the things in facilitating small groups is that we don't want to just blurt out a response. We might want to make sure that the groups that we're facilitating do go through those different stages and reflect a little bit on every step of the way, rather than just seeing something, reacting, end of story. So do be aware of that sort of sequence, the observation, the response, the interpretation, and the decision. It's really helpful if we can make sure that we go all the way down through that. So for instance, if we're looking at a Bible passage, and there's lots of biblical material within the LLF course, we might want to think a little bit in terms of approaching a Bible passage. The observation: what words struck you as you read it? What stood out for you? And then a response: what surprised you? How did you feel? And then something about interpretation. What questions do you have about this? What would you like to find out more about? And then a decision: what challenges does this pose to us? What might be our next step? So thinking a little bit about triggers, all sorts of triggers at play, and it's good to be aware of those. There's no good denying the fact that they're there. Some in the groups that we're leading come with a very strong response. Somebody might make a statement and it brings back a memory, a trigger, and the sense of it being almost overwhelming. So we need to be alert to this, both in the group but also in ourselves. And triggers take many different forms. There are theological triggers, emotional triggers, physiological triggers, intellectual triggers. Of course, triggers can be a positive thing. It can be a really positive thing. How did you respond? What would have helped in a particular situation? Perhaps if you call to mind a time that you were in a situation and you noticed you suddenly reacted in a particular way. How did you respond? What would have helped? How could you have been prepared? We need to be alert to these and manage them, yes, but even better if we can actually use them in a positive way. It can be a positive trigger, but it can be also a distraction. It could be that we're so caught up in something that's triggered for us that we then miss the rest of what is being said. So we need to think carefully and be aware of triggers, both in ourselves and for others in the group that we're facilitating. So we need to sound a note of caution. There will be moments in the courses that we're leading where there are triggers, and there could be a whole number of different responses. There could be people who just want to kind of leave, get up and go. The flight or the fight or the freeze response. So we need to be alert. Different people will react to these triggers in different ways. Some will want to just run away or clam up, and others will want to fight back and so on. And we need to manage those carefully and well. So when we're looking at these sorts of things, we're trying to create braver, safer spaces. I don't think it's helpful for us to shy away from some of the important issues. We want to be able to have honest sharing of views and so on. And the guidance in the LLF course about how we can go about making braver, safer spaces may be really useful. I think preparing is really helpful. We'll talk a little bit in a while about how we can prepare ourselves for each session. but it might be helpful for you to prepare people in the group. So at the end of one session, you might want to say a little bit about what's coming up next week, help people to think about that. The resources for the LLF are freely available on the Church of England website in the LLF section. Nothing at all to stop people from having a look at it in advance. There are no secrets there. It might be really helpful for people to have a first look and then come a little bit more prepared, ready for the next session. We want to check in every so often, rather than just steamrolling through the whole session. We might want to just pause every so often to give space to follow up and be prepared. Just say, how are things? How are we doing? Give some space just at regular points, just to make sure that we're on board and so on. That's a good use of time. That's not an unhelpful diversion, but useful just to make sure that we're okay along the way. And also thinking about boundaries as well. We need to be very clear about how we can honour each other in that space. And within the LLF course, the first session quite deliberately and unapologetically invests quite a lot of that time in looking at boundaries and group agreements and so on, thinking about what you feel safe to share and what nobody should ever feel under any pressure to say something that they don't feel comfortable to say. But nonetheless, if we can, to create an environment where people do feel able to share things, and that would be beneficial. We want to hear all sorts of different views and to have a genuine curiosity to understand and to learn from each other in this process. And that way we can work through that four-stage process, from the observation to the response. We can then do some interpretation ourselves, but also interactively with others, and then come to some sort of sense of, do I still think what I did before, or has my view changed a little bit? If I still think what I did before, has it helped me to understand why I believe what I believe? Or has it helped me to understand why other people don't hold the same view as me? And these are really helpful parts towards the end of that sequence in our decision making. One of the questions that often comes up in all of this is, as a facilitator of an LLF group, can you be neutral? No, it's impossible. You will have your own views and thoughts. Nobody comes in a vacuum to the sorts of discussions that we're having. So you're not expected to be impartial. But nonetheless, as in your role as a facilitator, you might like to try and be multi-partial. So I think a really good skill for us is to, in being hospitable as a host and as a facilitator, that we make sure that we do hear a wide range of different views. And if we feel that a lot of the views being said are similar, we might well want to ask questions just to tease out, is there somebody who thinks something different, or how might others view this? And we'll come on to look at some really good questions, some open questions that might help to tease that out a little bit further. In terms of when things get difficult in the conversations, I think we need to be sensitive. We need to be optimistic and careful about how we go about it, recognising a whole number of different views and ideas. Conflict can feel deeply personal, and we need to be very aware of that. It can be a potentially divisive thing. I hope very much that we can conduct our groups and our discussions in a way that doesn't cause division, but actually causes us to be much closer and understand each other rather better. Conflict can affect our life patterns. It can be unsettling if unresolved and so on. So we need real care in some of this. So in terms of how we go about this, we need to anticipate that these are difficult conversations, and that there may be different people with a wide range of views within our group, and we actually need to welcome that rather than stifle that. We want good, open conversation, but there are good ways of doing that and less helpful ways. As I say, to model curiosity, to ask good questions. I wonder what that would mean, or I wonder how that would feel. I wonder what it feels like to be in that situation. To inject hopefulness, to encourage a sense of positivity amongst the group. That's a real helpful thing to model. For us to establish boundaries, and as I say, we'll look at that further. These are helpful things to manage the conflict well, not to avoid difficult conversations, but nonetheless for them to be held in a good way. That thing about curiosity, these are good questions to be exploring. Does someone have a different view? Tell me a bit more about that. I wonder if you'd like to share some more. That's particularly good if you feel that somebody's just opened up and perhaps hasn't spoken as much as some of the others in the group. What led you to that conclusion? What insights have we gained from this conversation? And that's a nice one, because that's not directed at any one person. That could be to the whole group, and anybody who wants to could then respond, but particularly emphasizing new insights rather than just our own entrenched views and so on. What new insights? What have you learned? What's been fresh and interesting? So this disagreement seems to be about, and sort of recapping and putting into perhaps less pejorative language can be helpful, just to say or to name what it is that perhaps in this discussion different people are expressing and holding. We've talked about disagreements, but where do we see common ground? Where can we see, rather than just focusing on perhaps the small part that's different, where do we hold the common ground? Where do we agree? So that's something about how we can manage conflict, not hide it, but rather to handle it in a safe and good way. Let's think a little bit about how we can make these braver and safer spaces. And some of these things come out at a whole number of different, these are nice things: intention, impact, ignorance. So intention, where something wasn't usually meant, it wasn't that somebody meant to hurt somebody else in the group, but we need to think about the impact of that. And indeed, if that's come out of an ignorance, that can be born out of sort of personalizing language, where it's really good to own some of the things that we say. So I feel this, or I've always noticed that. But if people keep using sort of expressions like "you do this" or "they are always doing this," it can become something of a caricature. So we want to encourage people to own the statements that they're making, and to watch for that. Can be a danger of victimizing. You express a different view, you cry victim, it's not necessarily your own position, but you inhabit the space on behalf of a different group or a different position in order to sort of fight their corner for them, and that can actually be unhelpful, but if done really carefully and sensitively, can actually be useful in terms of empathy and understanding. One of the problems with conflict is often about sort of trying to impose our views on somebody else, and it's very clear in our small group work in difficult subjects, but particularly on LLF. We want to avoid that absolutely at all costs. You know, those sorts of things where people say, well, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, then ... or we obviously need to. And there's a great sort of imposition and assumption that if you're going to be a good Christian, then this is what you must think. It's about imposing your view and putting some sort of rather unhelpful bias or emotional leverage into that. So we want to try as facilitators to make sure that people are not imposing their view on others, but all the views that are being expressed have an equal standing and weight. But there's also that accusation where somebody just blurts something out in a very unhelpful, aggressive, accusatory sort of way, and that can just stop the conversation dead. So we need to be alert to these different things in order to create braver and safer spaces. And I hope those are good things for us to be aware of, not just in terms of LLF, but in other contexts as well, when we're having those slightly tricky conversations as a PCC, or thinking about our mission action plan, or our sort of future strategy or priorities, or stewardship, those sorts of things. These same principles can be useful to be aware of and to manage. So let's think a little bit about qualities of a good facilitator. What would be helpful in terms of our kit bag, our skill set? One who serves. So that's a concept that we're all familiar with as Christians. We want to serve the group. We want to make sure that we give the group as good an experience as possible. We want to be selfless, so it's about making sure that we don't speak too much. There's obviously material that we want to get across and share with the group participating in the course, but nonetheless to be selfless and create plenty of space for others. To be curious, we've talked about that already, but just to ask good, curious, searching questions. I wonder if, what would that mean for us here at in our church? To be observant, to be alert, spend a little bit of time as those discussions are unfolding and taking place, looking at the group. What's the body language? Who's participating? Who's sitting forward? Who's animated? Who's kind of crossed their arms and become defensive? To be undistracted, so to give your whole attention, your whole self to the task for the 90 minutes of each session. To be unanxious. It just comes across. If you're calm and you create a safe space and feel at ease, then that immediately puts everyone else at ease as well. To be hospitable, welcoming. People lead busy lives, so the fact that they're coming along to share in the course is a generosity on their part in terms of the time that they're giving to it. So recognise that, be hospitable and welcoming. To be hopeful, not to see this as some sort of huge problem, but these discussions to be a useful opportunity for us to try and hear what the Spirit is saying to us as an individual church and in the wider church as well, to relish that chance to hear and discern, to pray, to reflect, and to be loving. I think one of the great skills for us as facilitators is to love the people who have come in that group, those who hold views that perhaps we can get beside very easily, and perhaps those who we don't hold the same views as, but to love them as children of God, as baptized members of God's church, God's family, and to love them unequivocally. Really helpful. So now let's look a little bit specifically at facilitating the LLF course. This is 5 sessions, each lasting about 90 minutes or so. And there's a nice little section here, some useful acronym here, all beginning with P, about partnering, preparing, performing and pondering. So let's have a look at each of those in turn. First, partnering. Really helpful if we can facilitate the LLF course with somebody else. It helps for one person to perhaps lead one particular piece of the session. The other one can be attending to the group dynamics and being observant and caring and so on. And then a different bit of the same session you might swap over. It's also helpful because it means that if there are difficulties, one person can respond to that. And even better if you can partner and facilitate with somebody who holds slightly different views to your own, and that will be another way of a check on ourselves, just making sure that we are being balanced and fair in the way that we are facilitating the course. Then there's something about preparing, really important that we spend a little bit of time before each session we come to it, and of course the first and most important way of preparing for each session is to pray. So I would encourage you to spend some time in prayer, thinking about the session and those who will be coming. I'd encourage you at the beginning of each of the 5 sessions to commit that time to prayer, and we'll look at the timetable in a moment. Preparing the material, making sure that you've got everything that you need. You've got your course book. Others, if you want them to all have a copy of the book, have got it as well, or have access to it online. And you've got the story films that are an important part of the resource as well. So let's think a little bit about how we do that, looking at the materials, managing the time, thinking and making sure that we've got the participants that we're expecting, and that you yourself are prepared as well. Then coming on to performing, I'm slightly hesitant about that word. It makes it sound like we're putting on a show. As facilitators, we want to make sure that everybody who comes along is taking part and to an extent performing, but we need to help that to happen. So as part of the session, we use something called the Pastoral Principles, and this is really helpful. These are things that have been drawn up, recognised barriers to the way that we can discuss and live well alongside each other. So I do commend those to you, and each session looks at one or more of those pastoral principles. As an aside, there is a separate course which is just based upon, there's a 5-session course looking at the pastoral principles themselves for living and learning well together. I'd commend that to you. The LLF course is obviously the priority at the moment, but don't forget about the Pastoral Principles course. That would be a really good thing to do as a follow-up. It might be the basis for a PCC away day, or a course over 5 sessions in an evening or an afternoon with some key people. Perhaps the whole congregation could be invited, or some who have particular roles and responsibilities in the life of your church. They're really helpful things for us, just making sure that we haven't made assumptions, we haven't carried ourselves in and our conversations in a way that perhaps hasn't addressed some of these unspoken prejudices and blind spots that need addressing and acknowledging. And here's a possible timetable for each session. I think it's a helpful one. I think 90 minutes is about right. You want to feel that you've come to something useful and worthwhile, but more than 90 minutes, I think probably people will start to lose energy and focus. And there's a timetable, so please begin with welcome and perhaps introductions and a time opening in prayer. And then as each session develops, a couple of story films looking at a passage of the Bible. And the story films are really great because they help to root the whole thing in real life. They're powerful Members of the group may find some of those films disturbing or uncomfortable, while others may find some of those films reassuring. It's important to be aware that the films are likely to trigger strong emotional responses, and so good to allow some space for that. The purpose of the films is to remind us of the diversity that exists among followers of Jesus in our churches, and to remember that questions of identity, sexuality, relationships and marriage have a real life impact on all of us in different ways. The films don't necessarily reflect the teaching of the Church of England, but they enrich our learning together as we encounter people seeking to follow Christ. They invite us to allow their stories to take root in our hearts and our prayers. And I think each film is to be received and prayed about, not to be dissected or analysed. Each film has been agreed by the person or people that are involved in it, and it's in their words. It may be helpful as we view those films and briefly discuss them afterwards, to almost think of the people that are in those films as with us in the room, so that the group engages in learning and discussion and prayer in a way which is really courteous and respectful to the people who've featured in those films. And then drawing things together at the end, closing reflection and prayer. Resist the temptation to come out with some sweeping sort of conclusion. So as a result of this session, we've decided that ... because of course we haven't all decided anything, but we've heard a range of views on X and Y, and now let's commit that to prayer as we go from here. So something about managing the time. And then pondering, encouraging people to think and to reflect further, to take what they've heard in the group and to reflect upon it, but reminding people nonetheless to respect the confidentiality that has been agreed at the beginning of the course, not to take those conversations and start gossiping and tittle-tattling with people outside of the course, but nonetheless to spend some time with God, praying, pondering, reflecting. And it would be good at the beginning of the next session just to say, have any thoughts struck you since last time? Anything that you'd like to share that's come to you in terms of your time of reflection? What to say in conclusion, thank you so much for being a facilitator. I think it's a skill, it's a wonderful privilege. It's something that really makes or breaks the groups that meet in all sorts of ways as house groups and so on. But particularly in terms of LLF, a good facilitator can make this such a positive, exciting, enriching, insightful experience. So I want to say thank you for being willing to be a facilitator, and I hope that will be a rewarding and a good experience for you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this film, to think a little bit about our skills as facilitators, how we can do that in a good way. I realise that a film isn't so interactive as training sessions, but given the number of people we hope will need to think about facilitating a group, this felt like a really good way to do that. But if you have any specific questions or concerns, do get in touch with me, Will Gibbs. My email is will@stmarysredbourne.org. I'm in the Diocesan directory and it'll come up on the screen now as well. Please get in touch if you have any questions about facilitating the course, or if you have any other questions about LLF. I'd really want to encourage you. I hope it'll be a very enriching experience for you and for others, and thank you for taking the time and trouble to do that. Last of all, I do want to encourage you and everybody who's involved in the course to spend some time at the end reflecting a little bit about what we've heard, what we've learned, what we've shared together, and then to provide some feedback. The Church of England is wanting to hear lots and lots of different views, and voices as part of its listening. So please do go onto the portal and give that feedback. There's a Survey Monkey which you can then look at perhaps as a group and just come to some agreed answers, or you might want to do that as an individual and say something about what you've heard and what you've learned from being a part of the course. So thank you for your part in the LLF journey here in St Albans Diocese. God bless.